Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Slight apologies here, we had a little technical malfunction, which I don't know what happened, but we're up and running. This is a talk about the Stornoway Borough Commission and then Stornoway Town Council from 1862 to 1975. And I'm pleased that tonight beside me is the last Provost of Stornoway, who shall be able to regale us with many stories and tales of true stories, we hope, and a few tales. Sandy Matheson.
Thank you, Chairman. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm not quite sure where to start and where I'm going. You'll appreciate that talking about, as Malcolm said, Stornoway Town Council is rather perhaps too recent to talk too deeply about, not least because I'm delighted that one of the few of our remaining colleagues from the last Stornoway Town Council is here tonight. That's Councillor Ray Mackenzie, but we'll come to his part in the downfall of the Provost in due course. But I just want to start off with something of an icebreaker. And that is, when I came in, you weren't all here, but Malcolm, from his position as chair of the society, said, when you come forward, Sandy, come forward and sit in this chair. It's broken. And, well, that didn't bother me too much because it gave me a lead-in which I hadn't thought of until tonight. And that is some 55 years ago, when I had no pretensions whatsoever or even thought of becoming a public figure. I was in college at Robert Gordon's, allegedly studying pharmacy. And for reasons which I had never been able to understand, one night I found myself amongst all the senior, big, well-qualified students who called themselves the College Athletic Association. And I was there representing pharmacy. Young, inexperienced, but not without some knowledge of procedure of meetings. And as I was sitting, and the president, Mr. Johnson, was going on in the way that student assemblies do, I moved in my chair, and it gave a huge explosive sound, and everyone looked at me, and I said, because I was trying to be procedurally correct, I said, and looking at Mr. Johnson, I said, my apologies to the chair. And of course, they all thought that I was being pretty clever. I was only being a punctilious little ponce, but never mind. So that got me off in that organisation to a good start. However, we're going to talk tonight about local government in Stornoway prior to 1975, and as Malcolm has said, that does really, for most of this audience, encompass the Stornoway Town Council and the council before that, which wasn't called the Town Council, but we'll come to that. However, first of all, I just want to go through one or two aspects of Stornoway prior to the creation of formal and official local government. Like many other people in this audience who have been researching Stornoway, one of the prime sources of knowledge is Willie Cook Mackenzie, who was a freeman of the borough of Stornoway, and we'll perhaps come to that later on under Malcolm's guidance. But he wrote a number of very, very well-researched, good books about Lewis and about Stornoway. And one of the key points that took me when I was quite new to this game of local history was the derivation of the name Stornoway. Now, many of you will know exactly what I'm going to say, and I have to say sometimes you always know exactly what I'm going to say, but I don't. But anyway, Stornoway, Stornavager, Old Viking, Old Norse, Old Icelandic tongue, meaning Stornow, an anchor, Vager, a bay, Anchor Bay, which is the original meaning of the word which we know, after many changes, as Stornoway. However, that Stornoway became identified as a small community. It wasn't even a village, more than 1,000 years ago, when we do know that in the 12th century, that is the 1100s, during the Viking superiority of the Western Isles, and as you know, right down the Western Isles as far as the Isle of Man, there was a Viking invasion, and the Vikings, as they often did, stayed over winter here and didn't go back home, although a party always went back home. This group would always stay in a place which met their expeditionary requirements, if you want. They required fresh water, a sandy beach, and a sheltered harbour for their longboats. They got these three things in Stornoway Bay, Loch Stornoway if you want. We all know it's a sheltered harbour. We all know that there is an ample supply of fresh water, at least from the Creed and possibly from what we now call Willow Glen Road. But more importantly, there was a beach. Now, where was that beach? That beach was, we know it now as North Beach and South Beach. And if in your imagination you take away all the structures that are there, the quays, the piers and all that, you would actually find rock now. But in those days there were sandy beaches, very much like the beach that still exists on South Beach between number 1 and number 2 piers, where this wonderful skeleton framework of the isle layer is at present. So if you imagine the whole of what we call the Point Peninsula, that is with the backbone on Point Street, has been an isthmus sticking out into the bay with sand on either side. And that is where the Vikings pull their longships up to repair them and get them ready for further action in following summer. Now, they also built a castle. And that castle has disappeared, but many of us know that it is under number 1 pier. And again, as I look around the room, I'm sure some of the young boys, at least in our school days, we used to go under the piers and walk from strut to strut and jump from jump. And we found for ourselves, although everybody else knew about it, the rock on which the castle was built. And the first known chief of the castle was a gentleman called Nicol Hasson. And you'll not be surprised when I tell you that Nicol Hasson has now been transmogrified into Nicholson. So whatever the MacLeods and the Mackenzies and the Mathesons and the McDonalds say about it, Nicol Hasson was the first, a Norwegian chieftain, if you want. So that was the beginning of Stornoway, which started on what is now the Point Street Peninsula. All changed, but that was the kernel of Stornoway, which over the years spread and spread. It spread into, and I'm now jumping forward quite a long time, 4 centuries, up to the 16th century, the 1500s. And it was in the 1500s that really Stornoway as a village on the shore began to develop. And it developed really under the recognition that the sea, the Minch round Stornoway, was rich in fish, in particular herring with whitefish and other sorts of fish over on the west side. It was so important that actually there was a period when the Dutch Klondikers came and worked out of Stornoway, catching fish and transporting them back to Holland. Now this was all 500 years ago, so Stornoway began to develop. But to cut a very long and interesting story short, which I've actually given to the society at previous lectures, it became clear that there was a necessity for some form of management, of governance, of controlling the activities in a sensible, manageable way, with a sizable profit for whoever was at the top of the crest, whoever was the boss. And as I've indicated, the bosses to begin with were the Vikings, then the Lord of the Isles, then the MacLeods, then the Mackenzies. And it was at that time that Stornoway first got its identifiable form of government through a charter. There was one of 1511, but it wasn't particularly lasting. The main charter, and I'm grateful to Malcolm for helping me to put my thoughts in order on this, was in 1607, when King James the Sixth and First of Britain granted a charter to some of his friends to go to this supposedly rich place called Stornoway and hold it for the king and for the crown. And that gave us the period of the Five Adventurers. That turned out to be something of a disaster. The history shows that, as is ever the case, people came in, took over a place, and the way they held power was to get all the other people divided into different camps so that they never came together to challenge the incoming power. The eternal story of history, actually. But anyway, a consequence of that was that the MacLeod clan, who were the chief clan, fell to fighting amongst themselves, and ultimately their possessions were taken over by the Mackenzies, the clan Seaforth. And I have with me a copy of the charter of King James, which was granted in 607. I shan't read the whole thing, but just to give you a flavour of what it was. James, by the grace of God, King of Great Britain, France and Ireland, defender of the faith, to all good men of his whole land, clerical and lay, greetings. Know that we have given, granted, disponed, and by this our present charter, and the tenor of the same, to give, grant, and dispose, and confirm in perpetuity to our aforesaid cousin and counsellor, James Lord Balmerino. We all know about Balmerino.
You know who the current Lord Balmerino is as well?
Yes, the current Lord Balmerino's a street. Our Secretary and President of our College of Justices within our realm of Scotland, and to Lord George Hay of Nethercliff, Knight, one of a gentleman of our Privy Chamber, and James Spence of Wormston, and so on. So these three men were given a charter to control the place. But again, it didn't work out, because they were, as I mentioned earlier, part of the Fife, because they all came from Fife, the Fife Adventurers. But we've got to move on very quickly to the next owners, and I'm moving on something like Port Malcolm, 200 years to 1823.
Yeah, still the Mackenzies.
Yeah, because by this time the Mackenzies had been and were actually, although they didn't know it, reaching the end of her superiority, the Mackenzies under Lady Hood, the last living daughter in the Mackenzie clan. She had been married to Admiral Hood, who had died. She, a young widow from the east, was part of the Bran Seers prediction about some of the things that went on in Louis. Anyway, Lady Hood had an interesting life, but she, for all that she was an aristocratic lady, accustomed to do the Mackenzies, like all clan chiefs, to get in their way and doing things their way. On the 25th of September 1825, she prepared a disposition, a few charter, which again I'll quote from the beginning of. The Honourable Mary Frederica Elizabeth Stuart Mackenzie, with the special advice and consent of James Alexander Stuart Mackenzie, her husband, and the said James Alexander Stuart Mackenzie, for his own right and interest, empowered the feuars of Stornoway to elect 9 of their number to be magistrates and councillors, 2 of whom were to be bailies, 1 was to be a treasurer, and the other 6 to be councillors. Now, that actually predated many other forms of town and city governance. It was election by the feuars. Now, the feuars were the people who owned a few granted to them by the superior, in this case, Lady Frederica Mackenzie. But it didn't include ordinary people like we know today, ordinary voters over a particular age. It didn't include people who were merely tenants. It was to the feuars. But at least it was a step in the direction of governance by people who lived and moved and had their being within the community. So after that, that limped on really as a form of government until much later on, when in the middle of early years of Victoriana, as you know, the Victorians were very great starters, innovators in a whole host of things, not least in what we might call governance and the codification of law. And in Queen Victoria's time, in 1862, now Malcolm, you're going to have to help me here, because in 1862 they prepared and passed an act which allowed for the creation of what we almost call local government now. And it said, in essence, that if a number of people in a community got together and petitioned the sheriff of the county, in this case the county of Ross and Cromarty, they could set up a local government body. And in, what are we starting with, Malcolm? 1862, the national legislation appeared which gave the town of Stornoway a council. In fact, it wasn't a council as we know it. It was called the Borough Commissioners, and they were commissioned to buy on behalf of the community services and to provide certain services for the good of the community. Now, a petition seeking to set out and establish a borough authority was drawn up by a gentleman called Napier Campbell, who was a solicitor in the town. He actually became the first town clerk, but we'll come to that. And it was signed by Kenneth Smith, few holder, John Morrison, few holder, John Macaulay, few holder, Norman McKeever, note that one, Norman McKeever, few holder, John Chisholm, merchant, Malcolm MacLeod, few holder, Malcolm MacDonald, baker, Thomas Reid, again a famous name in Stornoway's development, Viewholder, Murdo MacDonald merchant, Malcolm Mackenzie merchant, James Mackenzie merchant, viewholder, Andrew Gibson, A. Murray, John Mackenzie, Alan Morrison, Roderick Mackenzie, Roderick Morrison. Now, these people petitioned the sheriff, and the sheriff in due course agreed to grant their petition, and Stornoway got its first, if you want, council. People were again voted in by the feuars, and that was the big breakthrough. And from then onwards, and we're going to deal with the personalities in a minute, Malcolm, very, very briefly, we moved through to 1892 when there was a new act which changed the situation from being a borough under borough commissioners to a council, and that was ratified and further established in 1902 under the creation of the town council, the borough of Stornoway. And we know that from that time Stornoway was managed, governed by the town council under what was called a borough of barony. Now, we're not going to go into the wonderful story of a borough of barony, but it suffice it to say that the town council was set up. This was as distinct from a county council. We, at that time, were part of the county council of Ross and Cromarty, and we had obviously got representatives to go there. But you might like to hear something about the duties imposed by the Act on Stornoway Town Council from 1892 onwards.
Stopped having chief magistrates,
yes,
and they had provosts.
Yes, they moved the head man, instead of being called chief magistrate, was called provost, and the two gentlemen who were with him, called before that junior magistrates, became the baillie, senior and junior baillie, and there were the 6 other councillors. Now, this is a flavour of what the town council were required to do, and we should always remember that, as is still the case, a council can only do what it is empowered under an Act of Parliament to do. It cannot just set its hand and say, we're going to do that, because that would be what they call ultra vires. So always remember that even to this day, the council can only do what it is given to do by statute. However, the Stornoway Town Council, and I remember these committees, and I'm sure Ray does as well, the Works and Water and Highways Committee had remit with regard to buildings, sewers and drains, parks, open spaces and recreation ground, water supply, water plant, fire extinguishing. That really means to set up a fire brigade, and that's another very interesting part of our history, but not for tonight. Foot's and pavements, also highways, roads and streets, and a very interesting one which we don't see nowadays, water in the streets. I have to say that in my time on the bench, every Monday morning, we met with gentlemen who had been arrested and taken to court for doing exactly that. But that's another matter. There was also the Lighting and Cleansing Committee and the Public Health Committee with regard to lighting of the streets, lampposts, gas, and the courts, that is all the little alleys and courts which stemmed off the streets in Stornoway, to lighting for streets, areas, courts, houses, stables, byres, common passages and stairs, and the removal and disposal of dust, manure and other matters vested in the council by section 107 of the Act. Also with regard to latrines, urinals and water or earth closets, markets and slaughterhouses, very important, and also certain public health works, except as regards hospitals which fell under another part of the legislation. And there was to be also a finance committee with regard to raising money by way of assessment or by borrowing, the authorisation of payments from the funds of the borough, wherever they came from, by rents, sales and so forth. Also with regard to the treasurer's books as to finance generally, and with regard to law, parliamentary and other such business. Welcome.
Can I just add on? Of course, you've got to remember, the public wanted to know what was going on. There was the Highland News only came to Stornoway in 1893. So up until 1893, they had a town crier and bellman going around, oh yeah, oh, I don't know what he was saying. But his name was Neil MacLeod from New Valley, and he apparently had a very loud voice.
Oh. Yeah. A loud voice.
Yeah, and then of course after that, the town council was being reported upon. Well, was appearing in the.
I'm sure some here of the old Stornowaysians remember. Oh, yes. we still had a town crier.
Yes. Yeah.
Who went round shaking his bell, shouting "Water off at 12:20, water off," as he would go through the town.
Absolutely.
The bell that the town crier had, I don't know what's become of it. I hope it's still in the museum. It used to be in the town council chambers, and it had somehow made its way to Canada.
I heard it's all clapped out.
Yes. It was also cracked, Malcolm. That's the bell. Now, where were we before we went there?
Well, you were going through the duties.
Yes, we had finished that. So that is what the council had to do. But also, the council, and this is very important to try and get a grasp of, the council was part of Ross and Cromarty County Council, and they were charged with providing other services like education, just to take one example. They also had a public health role, and in later days they had a social care remit. But in Stornoway, and I remember it very well when I was borough treasurer, every year we were requisitioned by Ross and Cromarty County Council for works and services in Stornoway which had been supplied by Ross and Cromarty County Council. And naturally that was an area of great debate between us and the County Council about how much was properly attributable to the borough as distinct from, if you take education, child from out with Stornoway was educated at the cost of the County Council. Mm-hmm. The school was provided after the parish boards by the County Council. But the County Council then said, oh, but you have X number of children in the school who live in Stornoway. Now you, Stornoway Town Council, will make a contribution to their education costs. The same happened with some roads in Stornoway. Some roads were what we would call classified highways, and they were maintained, built and maintained by the County Council. There were other roads and lanes and whatnot in Stornoway which were maintained, lit, built, kept clean by the Town Council. And once again, the County Council requisitioned the Town Council. So what I'm trying to show is this intimate link between the two bodies under the law. And of course, because we in Stornoway were paying for County Council services, we perforce had representatives on the County Council from the Town Council. And every year the Town Council would elect 3 councillors to go to Dingwall to be members of the County Council. That always raised the very difficult point when Mrs. Urquhart or whomsoever who was on the Town Council, or Sandy Matheson or Donald Stewart or John the Barber to really put it in focus, we went there. Were we going there? We were there as county councillors, not as town councillors. And we weren't delegates of the town council either. We had to go there to look after the interests of the borough. But we didn't have to go by any particular policy that the council, the Stornoway Town Council, had decided upon. And that was an area of great problem and difficulty for people who served on both bodies. Now, one of the other interesting aspects of local governance in Stornoway was the fact that, first of all, there was this body, Stornoway Pier and Harbour Commission. And I'm delighted to see the author of a wonderful book about Stornoway, the history of Stornoway Harbour, here tonight. But as she and I know very well, that created its own problems, because it, amongst its remit for members to serve on it, stipulated that 3, or was it 2, must come from the town council. So the town council of Stornoway every year sent 3 to Dingwall, 3 were appointed to the Harbour Commission, along with people who were appointed to the Harbour Commission under other acts. And then, of course, after 1923, Malcolm,
3 to the Stornoway Trust.
We had the creation of the Stornoway Trust, and the Stornoway Trust were required by the Act, the Deed of Trust by Lord Leverhulme, to have a number of town councillors on the trust, to wit the provost, who was of the town, who would be ex officio the chairman of the Stornoway Trust. So the minute you became provost of Stornoway, you automatically became the chairman of the Stornoway Trust.
And Sandy, remember Provost Louis Bain lived in the castle?
Yes, I'm coming to that. We'll come to him when we deal with the provost, will we?
Okay, yeah.
He is the provost and the 2 bailies and 1 other councillor had to go on to the Stornoway Trust. So here you are, and this is really where I'm building up to. We had, when you were elected to the town council, you could, within, as I found and as Ray found and the others, all of a sudden you were automatically on to other bodies. You were on to the Trust, you were on to the County Council, and you were on to the Harbour Commission. And sometimes we had councillors who served on all 4 of those bodies. And it was a very heavy workload. But they were completely separate organisations. And one of the highlights of certainly my experience of the council was the fact that on a Monday night we would have our town council meeting, or the committees thereof, every month. Traditionally, once a month on a Tuesday, there was a meeting of Stornoway Pier and Harbour Commission. And then traditionally on the Friday night, I think the last Friday of the month, or maybe the first Friday, the Friday anyway, there was a Stornoway Trust meeting. And you suddenly found that the people that you had a rammy with on the Monday night were there in front of you on the Tuesday night to have another rammy. And then you went to the Stornoway Trust on a Friday night and they were there again. And as I said, there were a number of councillors who served on both bodies. I think, Malcolm, I'm now getting ready to move into the dialogue between myself and yourself about provosts. But I just want you to remember, when we start getting a wee bit, what's the word, flippant, and I start perhaps getting saying things that might be defamatory about some of our councillors who served in all these different bodies, I think we should pick out the provosts first. And can you lead on that, Malcolm?
Well, we certainly can. Well, the first provost, you mentioned him earlier, in that he was one of those who had put his name down in 1864, or 1862, sorry, Norman McKeever, a shipbuilder and bank agent,
yeah,
who lived at 12 South Beach, and born in 1814 and died in 1879.
Yeah, 12 South Beach, by the way, is the house that we know as the Haven at the back of the town hall, where Tyres na Gaul is, or at one of the housing associations. It's still there. The McKeever family were related to the famous.
They're moving out. They've gone up to the Labour Exchange.
Oh, is that where they've gone? Oh. They do these things without asking me or telling me.
No planning permission.
Anyway, the McKeevers, he was a part of the McKeever of Gress family, yes. A famous family who farmed at Gress and were involved in the last duel yes. on the Coquelin, but that's not nothing to do with this. Norman McKeever, if I put it like this, there are still, and I'm going to mention it in the case of other people, there are still descendants of that family in Stornoway, because the Mcleans, the Skianochs, the bakers who had that house as part of a shop and the shop behind it are part of that family, right down to Norman the taxi and Beatrice and these people. So there is still a continuing link there with this Norman McKeever. I have a particular interest in Norman McKeever, which I think you'll perhaps allow me to mention, and that is the fact that he owned ships as well as being the bank agent. And one of the ships that he owned was a schooner called the Raven. Mm-hmm. And Norrie, like most businessmen, was a fairly hard man. And he sent the Raven off to the Mediterranean to come home with a load of salt for the herring curing industry. And of course, the skipper of the Raven was my great-grandfather, John Smith, who was the captain. And for one reason or another, which was never established, the ship foundered in the Bay of Biscay with the loss of all hands, including my great-grandfather. And I was always intrigued in that sometimes when the conversation in front of my granduncle, Brodie Smith, the son of John Smith, came round to Norrie McKeever, not Norrie McKeever that we knew, but Norman McKeever, the chief magistrate, there was a certain frisson in the room, because apparently Mr. McKeever, the first magistrate, had not been particularly careful in looking after the widows and so forth of that particular ship. Just a personal story. After Norman McKeever was Donald Munro. Oh,
well, yes, the Chamberlain of the Lewes.
The notorious Chamberlain of the Lewes. You've all heard about him. He was a person who was involved in practically every single aspect of life, and unfortunately abused his position to a very large extent and was ultimately sacked by his employers at James Matheson. Mm-hmm. A wonderful story told in Jim Shaw Grant's book called A Shilling for Your Scowl. We've got to move on, Malcolm. See that clock there? There was Captain Donald Mackenzie, ship owner. Can we jump over him?
Yeah, ship owner in Kenneth. Yes.
Was he a forebearer of a lady we call Maggie Captain?
Yes, I believe you're right there.
William Mackay, Chamberlain of Lewis. Now, he came from mainland, from Edinburgh area.
Yes, yeah, and he died in Nairn.
He died in Nairn, where he had retired. Matthew Russell. Well, we all know about Matthew Russell, and I'll spare you the details about his sale, where he put in his window, as you see nowadays, prices off and great competition, and he managed to put in his window a sign saying, Russell's trousers down again. But we move on to Murdo MacLeod.
Just in case people wonder where the shop was, it's where the Waverley buildings, as we would call them, but Thorley Guest House, and also the bookmakers around the corner.
Yeah, on that corner. It was called Russell's Corner at one stage.
Absolutely.
Then after was Murdo MacLeod, that a very famous family in Stornoway. Murdo MacLeod was the British of Linen bank agent, lived on South Beach, and his family are still continued in Stornoway down to John Cludy, Donald M. MacLeod. They were great-grandsons of this famous Murdo MacLeod, who also had a brother, Peter.
Yeah.
Peter MacLeod.
Peter Smart.
Peter Smart. They were called the Smarts because they were smart.
Baker as well.
And of course, when I mention John Cludy, I should also say that Elizabeth MacPhail, my one-time next-door neighbour, is of that same family. That was MacLeod's. Donald Smith, Fishcure, Dole, California.
Oh, yes, yeah. He had a brother called Kenneth California. They were from the Callanish area, if I remember.
They were from Carloway.
Carloway, yeah.
Good people from Carloway.
And they made money out in California.
They made their money in the 1849 gold rush.
Yes. And then they invested a lot of money in fishing.
Yes, and they were big
around the island.
They were big in fish. And Dole Smith built that magnificent villa on Springfield Road, at the corner of Matheson Road, right opposite
Springfield Road, yeah.
Springfield Road.
Yeah.
Yes, opposite the Wee School.
Yeah.
Called Springfield House, and subsequently Provost Mackenzie stayed there, but it was built by Dole, California. Yeah. Moving very quickly on, after
John Norrie Anderson.
John Norrie Anderson, again a famous man, lawyer, Anderson MacArthur, T.A. He was quite a character in the town. He said to
be one of the most ablest newsmen of all time.
That was what it was said.
You appeared.
But I wasn't there then, Malcolm. Anyway, that was John Norrie Anderson. None of his family are left here.
And then John Mackenzie.
John Mackenzie, Johnny and Charlie, as he was called, another fish merchant. He lived on James Street.
Yeah, next door to Brodie Smith.
Next door to Mr. Smith, yes. But James Mackenzie was a very interesting man too, because when we come to Provost Louis Bain, I'll make a connection there, which will hold for a minute.
And he had a promising son, William Davidson Mackenzie,
yes, who
died. He was badly gassed in the war, but he was a brilliant orator. But he died in 1931 because of
the wounds received.
Yeah,
he also had a daughter called Molly, but we'll come to her in a minute or two. John Mackenzie, Murdo Mclean merchant, Murdo Mclean and Sons Limited, on Cromwell Street, of recent closure.
Fish curers to start.
He started off as a fish curer, and
behind the Players, beside the Players cinema.
Yes, he had the site which is in our day was the cafe.
Yeah. Coffee pot. Yeah.
The coffee pot. Before that, it was Andrew Cabrelli's in our day.
And Maggie Jean's.
It was Maggie Jean's.
Yeah,
that's right. And that was where Mclean had his fish curing yard. And then he moved into Draper, and he built up his drapery business. And one of his descendants, Paul Mclean, owner of Nicholson Mclean, is still with us. Yes. And actually, Provost Murdo Mclean, his grandson, Roderick Ian Mclean, became a town councillor in the 1960s. We may come to him too. Yeah. Then after Murdo Mclean, there was Roderick Smith, pharmacist. Well, that's Brodie Smith, the founder of the shop and so forth. A very interesting gentleman, and I had a great, apart altogether from being his grandnephew and to some extent my grandfather, because my own grandfather had died when my mother was young, and Brodie Smith was, if you want, my grandfather. It's worth mentioning that he was provost, like Provost Mackenzie, on two occasions, and he, along with other people, was largely responsible for having Stornoway dry from 1924 to 1926.
1920 to 27.
7 years.
7 years.
Oh, big.
You got the itch after that.
A big thirst. Brodie Smith was one of the leading prohibitionists of the day, and it took him a long time to realise that the evils and social consequences of prohibition were actually more damaging than the booze itself. Hard to believe, but that was the case.
So there was 3 polls.
Yes.
And eventually they went back to voting
Ultimately, they went back, as you see, in 1927.
They were under the piers.
And I think the first one was it was called the Club Bar. Jock McCallum opened the first one after the closure of the Prohibition. Little interesting story about Brodie Smith and Prohibition to give you a notion of how bitter and dangerous, he knows it, things were. One night at the height of the Civil War for or against Prohibition, he was making his way home from the shop on the corner, Boots Corner now, and he was going up the back of the wall at the back of the hostel opposite Martin's. Some of us will remember there was a wall there at the back of the hostel, and something made him stop, and a huge big rock fell off the top of the wall and landed at his feet. And then, of course, immediately after that, there was the sound of running footsteps. So, rightly or wrongly, dear old Ruddy decided this was an attempt on his life. So, the next thing, he got onto the boat that night and went down to Glasgow and bought himself something to stop that happening again. And in 1958, when I was helping to clear up the shop under the management of that gentleman known as John the Chemist, I went into an old desk that hadn't been opened for X years. And you know what I found? I found a Colt 45 in a leather holster. Seriously. And now I went home and I said to my mother...
I thought he was a provost, not a sheriff.
I said to... exactly, I said to mother, I knew that uncle was provost and an honorary sheriff, but I didn't know he got a gun. And she told me the story that he had gone down and got this gun. Now, how Colt 45 was going to stop a rock falling off a wall onto you, I've yet to find out. Anyway, we must move on. Kenneth Mackenzie.
Of course.
Now, we come to a very famous family in the history of the Borough of Stornoway, Ross and Cromarty County Council, and I'm talking about Kenneth Mackenzie, the founder of the Tweed Mill, Kenneth Mackenzie down there, and once on Louis Street.
Ray, of course.
And that led, and we're glad to see Ray here tonight because Ray is the great grandson of Kenneth. Yes, Kenneth Ray. Yes, and he started off as a fish merchant, and he had his premises on Kenneth Street where the police station is now. And I remember that yard very, very well. It had barrel windows onto the street and so forth. Anyway, Kenneth Mackenzie served on the town council. He was provost, and then his son, who we'll come to, Alistair, was also provost. And as I say, the link is continued now for what, 100 and X years, yes, right down to our friend Ray tonight. Then after Kenneth Mackenzie, Louis Bain, famous for his kippers amongst many other things, famous for his brother John Bain, Chicago. And he was...
and he played for the first ever Aths team.
Did he?
Yes, yes. Oh, that's the most famous for
I didn't know that he had added that to his curriculum. But his brother John was the significant donor for the rebuilding of the town hall after it went by fire. And again, the Bain family still has descendants in Stornoway. If I can take the liberty of saying, tying it up with John Mackenzie, Provost Johnny and Charlie. Johnny's and Charlie's son, daughter Molly, married Kenneth Bain, a brother of Louis Bain, right? All very complicated. And the whole message is that the Bain family in Stornoway today John Bain was the ship surveyor that many of you would have known. They're the only of the families that have a double link with a provost through the Bains and the Mackenzies. So these three boys have that distinction. Louis Bain again, interesting. Alexander McLennan, Holy Alec. And he too has his descendants in Stornoway. Dare I mention Big Fred Bowie and Michael.
They're from South Loch, Maravig.
Yes, Maravig. When in local government, he was awarded a medal by His Majesty the King, King George V.
What was the MBE?
MBE, and of course the Wags immediately translated MBE as Maravig's best effort. So I knew the house Bellevue on Forgotil Road where Provost Holy Alec lived. Yeah. Interesting thing was his shop on Point Street has now, well, it's now Dig Big Chick.
Yeah, it was part of Charlie Morrison.
But it became part of Charlie Morrison's shop. So that was Holy Alec. After Holy Alec, another spell from Brodie Smith. Then we move on after Brodie Smith, 1939, to the appointment of Provost Alistair Mackenzie. A.J. Mackenzie, another distinguished citizen in Tweed and a great many other interesting and good causes. He himself was a very great character whom I had the pleasure of knowing in my early years on the town council. And of course, apart from his nephew, Ray, his daughter, Diana Mackenzie Geit, her son is, or was until recently, the principal private secretary to the Queen. He's now Lord Geit, and he owns and lives in property in Quebec, which takes him back to an interesting part of his own ancestry, but that's for another time.
Can I tell a little story about Alistair Mackenzie and Jimmy Todd, James McDonald, the mill? They went over to America, and they were signing in at an hotel in New York. And Alistair, having won a medal in the award, put in A.J. Mackenzie DSC, and Jimmy Todd put in James McDonald RNR.
Well, one would like to talk at length about Jimmy Todd, but we haven't got time tonight. But Alistair did win. Forgive me calling him Alistair. Provost Mackenzie did get the DSC because he was a young lieutenant in the First World War, and his vessel sank a German submarine.
A U-boat, yes, submarine.
A U-boat, a submarine. So he got his medal for that. Of course, he got various other medals as well for his distinguished public service over very many, many years. After Alec, John Mackenzie came Donald James Stewart of happy memory and great fame. He became a member of Parliament.
And he also worked for Mackenzie.
Yes. Well, there was a stage, and I'm sure I'll be forgiven for that. The number of people who served on the town council who came from that mill in one way or another. Alistair Mackenzie, Donny Stewart, Slim Jim,
James McRae,
James McRae and Councillor Ray Mackenzie. You know, there was something going on. No, anyway, quickly move on. Donald James Stewart, we all know and remember with happiness, John. Then Donald James. Then after that there came the eternally to be remembered Mrs. Urquhart. I could spend a week, as many of you could, talking about that wonderful lady.
From Kews.
The first.
And Smith.
A Smith from the post office, Kews, yes. Then after Mrs. Urquhart, Donald Stewart went back for a second term. After him came Alexander M. Matheson, hotelier.
Yeah, the man who got you in trouble.
The man, I'll come to that in a minute, the man who got me into trouble. Alistair Matheson of the Crown Hotel.
A good singer, and grandfather of Hans Matheson, the actor.
Yes, and the father of Gussie, married to ND's daughter. Anyway, Alistair was a native of North Uist via Glasgow, and unfortunately he was only provost for 18 months when he had to give up for ill health reasons. But Alistair was followed by another Alexander Matheson. And on one occasion, this Alexander Matheson, long after he had been the provost and was in another capacity, was down at Windsor Castle for a weekend, and on the Friday night the Queen and the Duke of Edinburgh came into the place where we were staying and would speak to everyone. And I was introduced to the Duke of Edinburgh as Alexander Matheson from Stornoway. The Duke looked at me with what I can only call a piercing gaze. Did you say Stornoway? Yes, said whoever was introducing me. Ah, I see. And he turned to me and he said, do you still own the Crown Hotel? So I had to explain that no, I never owned the Crown Hotel. I was never involved in his son's behaviour on the place. It was somebody else entirely. But it showed what a small world it was. So these were the province. Malcolm, do we have time to move on just to the town clerks?
Oh, yes. Yeah.
When do we finish?
Whenever we're thrown out.
Oh. Well,
there's no licensing or
prohibition. I just look at the town clerks, because they're next on the list. I mentioned Napier Campbell. We come to John Ross, the second town clerk, a solicitor. He had started off his life in the office of the infamous Donald Munro, and after Donald Munro was sacked, he was appointed as Chamberlain in his place, and by virtue of his involvement in the town, he became the town clerk. Then after that there was Archie Munro, a well-known gentleman from Behead Street.
Served for 34 years.
Yes, he was
well known for his round glasses and
he was a grand uncle by marriage of Ishbal Frocan, if I'm not mistaken. Anyway, Archie Munro was the rock on which Stornoway developed after the First World War. Yes. And he was succeeded by a man that I find it difficult to talk about without a degree of personal feeling and emotion, and that was Alistair MacLeod, town clerk.
Who did an awful lot for the housing.
Oh, Alistair, to my mind, was a real champion. Alistair MacLeod, famous Keith Street family. We heard when Kenneth was talking about the Lewis War Memorial, the builder, Angus MacLeod, was the father of this Alistair MacLeod. Alistair was the father of Margaret, who's still alive down in Tongue, and the late Sandra, who stayed up on Goodhill Road in the old family house. My view, I first met Mr. MacLeod when I was a little child, because I was allowed to move into the town council offices on the hand of Brodie Smith. And even then, I found that he was a nice, kindly man. Two little boys, no nonsense or anything, but he was just nice. Later on, as an adolescent, he did me a great many good deeds. And then, of course, in 1967, when I came on to the town council, he was a mentor, a teacher, ever patient with this young upstart of a child who was on the town council. Very nice man. Unfortunately, within 2 years of me coming on to the town council, he died. Relatively young man before he retired. But again, a distinguished family. He had other members of the family who were no less well known and contributed. And then, of course, Alistair was succeeded by my dear friend and sparring partner and colleague Murdoch MacLeod, aka Smoky, if you'll allow me to call him that, he too was very helpful and patient with me most of the time. I remember on one occasion when I went into his office, when I was the provost, I went into his office for my afternoon briefing before the town council met that night. And many people thought we were going in to stitch things up. Never. I was going in to be briefed. And Murdoch had a wonderful filing system. It was a pile of papers on his desk about this high. So I went into his office and I sat down opposite him, and the mere vibration of me sitting down caused this pile of papers to collapse. It spread all over the floor. And he looked at me and he said, "Provost, see what you've done now. Out of here, out of here." I went out back to my own place of business, and about an hour later, Pat, the young secretary, Pat MacLeod as she was, Pat France now I think, came into the shop very timidly and said, "Oh, Mr. Matheson, if you don't mind very much, the town clerk is ready to receive you now." So Murdoch and I were, as he was with so many other people, we were good friends, and I lament his passing only 5 years ago. So these were the town clerks, Malcolm.
There's a lot of posts, you know, there was the borough chamberlain,
Yes.
borough collector, and then there was the borough MOH.
Mm-hmm. Well, and the borough surveyor.
Yeah, that's right. Borough surveyors and borough prosecutors. And sanitary inspector.
Yes, well, the sanitary inspector was an interesting position, but I want just to mention that the borough chamberlain, our dear friend Kenny Nicholson, is still very much alive, and you'll see him up and down Macaulay Road walking every day.
And he went into post in 1958.
Well, he went into the post
after Malky Doll.
After Malky Doll. Malky Doll was anybody remember Malky Doll? I'm sure they do. Mr. Malcolm MacDonald, who was married to Chrissy Dodo. Yeah. There you are now. Anyway, Malky Doll, another MacDonald family of great interest in the town. Malky Doll was a lovely man too, and I remember as a student in Aberdeen, Malky took me under his wing. And as it so happens when students are alone in the big city, he would always say, "Now you will come out to the house on Sunday night after church or something," and I would go out to 35 Albury Place, and I would be regally entertained, like students often were, by locals who had living in Aberdeen. And on one occasion, I was there sitting having a cup of tea with Malky and Chrissy started, "Malky, Malky, look at him, see that profile? That's Brodie Smith, and he's going to be the provost of town yet." She was only out by 10 years, but that was Malky Doll. And after the borough surveyor, there was Tannahill,
yeah.
And after Tannahill, there was a couple of gentlemen that we didn't really know much about. And then the next famous man was Tommy Cruikshanks. And some of you may remember his son, who was about my, as I look at our vintage, Tommy, he got into a bit of...
Were you in his gang?
He ran away.
He went to the ragged school.
Yes, but before he went to the ragging school, he ran away. And there was a huge hue and cry in the town, 1956, wondering where this boy was. And the search parties out looking for him. And I remember the school, Nicholson, big new school was being built then. And there were people up there digging in the ground and going down into foundations in case he was in there. That was Tommy Cruikshank. But then after Tommy Cruikshank, who did 2 terms, there was the famous Colm McCallum. Again, a very fine man. Now, I haven't mentioned this before. Colm McCallum, as well as being the borough surveyor, was what was called the Master of Works. And we had an organisation in the town council that I haven't mentioned. and that is the Dean of Guild Court. Former Dean of Guild is with us tonight. Ray, I think, was the last Dean of Guild in the Town Council. And the purpose of the Dean of Guild Court was to give you a building warrant. If you were building a property, you had to go to Dingwall to get planning permission, but you also then had to come back to the local committee in the Town Council, the Dean of Guild Court, to get what was called your building warrant. And McCallum was the man who looked after that, along with a committee of 3 or 4 of the councillors. So that was Callum. Of course, we mustn't forget that all these officers in the council, in my time, Ray's time, and other people's time, we were always assisted by a band of lovely, helpful ladies who acted as secretaries and clerks and so forth. And I have happy memories of many of those people who really, in so many ways, kept the ship going.
We're okay for another 5 minutes.
Another 5 minutes. You're the boss, okay. How was the town clerks?
Yeah. You've also got to remember that you had a lot of manual workers as well working for
Of course, the borough squad.
Yeah, I know.
Full of wonderful characters. As I look across the gap here, there was...
well, the bin lorry. Lewis Quinn, Quinn McLeod was the driver.
He was a driver.
And then when you got the mechanical sweeper, the first driver was Angie Brummy MacLeod from MacLeod Road.
Yes. Well, there were dozens.
Before that, of course, he replaced Andra and all the boys on the wheelbarrows. Remember, they would empty the gullies.
Yes.
And sweep the streets.
That's right. They had a brush,
and they were stationed
a shovel,
up on James Street.
and a barrow. And there were also joiners and plumbers. John Dunn.
Yeah. John Murdo
Crack, Billy Brochan. Oh, far too many for me to remember.
Oh, no, yeah, we'll miss people out.
But
and even Sandwick Cemetery with Angus Ferguson, Pop, you know. The piper, Angus Ferguson.
Yeah, but he wasn't on the town council.
Oh, was Sandwick Cemetery not with the town council?
The cemetery was a county council function.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, So Angus Ferguson was a county... And
Willie Diamond was
in the good old days, we had a gaslighter.
Oh, yeah.
A gentleman who went round with a match on a stick.
Wasn't Dolto, was it?
I believe he was, yes.
McDonald.
There was, I don't know if Joan knows the story, but Jim Grant told a wonderful story about one time he was struggling in Newton into the face of a southwesterly wind, and he was nearly blown off his feet. And just as he was approaching one of the gas lamps, it went on. And he looked up, and there was Torkel at the top of the lamppost in the storm, saying a particular poem.
Dolto, not Torkel too.
Who?
It was Dolto.
Dole.
Yeah.
Torkel was his brother. Sorry about that, getting them mixed up. But this guy was up quoting appropriately and very aptly one of the famous poems about the southwest wind, which was... Anyway, somebody else I was going to mention.
There was another story that German tourists were walking along Newton, I think, and he was up the ladder and they were talking away in German, and he interjected and spoke in German to them. Because he had been a prisoner of war.
Of course.
And then it was reported back to the provost, whoever it was at that time, and said that the manual workers were very, very well educated when they could speak German.
The manual workers were based in the place at the bottom of Key Street.
Yes, yeah. On the James Street corner.
On the James Street corner, And of course, in early days, the fire brigade was part and run by the town council. And it wasn't until the Second World War that the Stornoway Fire Brigade was subsumed into the National Fire Service. And it was very interesting in my time, and I'm sure others will remember too, when the siren went, ooh, siren, to call out the fire brigade, the boys had to rush to the fire station, and many of them were borough workers.
Yes. Oh, yes.
And, you know, the town work squad would come to a halt because half a dozen of them were on the fire engine. I remember that quite well. Billy Brohan was one of them.
Yes.
Was Harry Cameron with us or with the county?
I'm not sure. He was certainly one of the. Yeah. Yeah.
John
Dunn was the fire.
Oh, well, John Dunn was with the town council, huh? Okay.
Okay, yeah, I think we're.
Have you?
I'll just ask, has there anybody got a last question before we close?
I'm welcome.
Yes, Ray.
Sandy brought something to mind. The day that I was appointed Dean of Guild, and Sandy on the same day was appointed Provost of Stornoway, and Doug Kennedy was appointed the Honorary Borough Treasurer. And you were 29, I was 26, and Doug Kennedy was 26. And when I went back to the mill, my brother came out and he said, well, who got the 3 appointments or whatever? And I said, well, Sandy's Provost, 29. Doug Kennedy's Honorary Borough Treasurer, 26. And, well, I wasn't given the ages, but he knew. And I said, I'm Dean of Guild. And he said, well, he says, between the 3 of you, you ought to sink Stornoway.
Yes, I'm quite happy to say in public you were younger than I ever was.
And I still am. The other thing was I got a phone call from my sister, and she was living in New Zealand by this time, and she said, I hear you're Dean of Guild. She says, what's a guild? And what's a dean? And what guild are you a dean of?
We should perhaps mention another factory. In the town council, there are still 5 councillors from that time alive. Myself, yourself, Donald Mackay, Aka Tas, Murdo Marut, and who was the other one?
Bill Lucas.
Who?
Bill Lucas.
Bill Lucas, yes, still going. And it's very interesting to know that of the Cohornanelan councillors from day one, there are only 4 of us left. Myself, Ray, Donny Lowdy and Reverend Brodie and Eiley or wherever, yes. So the 2 of us have a lot to answer for, Cove.
Looking at each other, you know, who's going to be first?
I'll finish off with a little.
Could be another duel.
A little. Now this is the final one. A little story, but true. In 1971, when I was elected provost, there was a tie of 4 votes each between myself and Bailey Albert Nicol, who had been my history teacher in school, and then he had been a colleague on the council. We each got 4 votes. And I remember that, as in those days, they had to choose between the 2 by lot. In other words, names in a hat. And one of the reporters from the Stornoway Gazette, I think it was Norman Putt, but it might have been Donny McInnes, went in and put his hand in and pulled out the name. And if chance would have it, the name was mine. So I became the provost of the town by lot. And Billy Forsyth, well-known wag around the town, was heard to say in a large, loud voice to everyone, he had been my patrol leader in the Scouts 20 years before that, when I was a wee fellow. He was in the shop and he said to the customers in the shop, well, he says, I knew that Sandy Matheson was small, but I never knew he was small enough to come out of a hat.
On that note, ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to thank you all for coming along, and I hope you heard one or two snippets of information that may be of future use. Thank you all.